In a special way, I want to welcome you to our 16th workshop in the PhD seminar series in business management. And the theme that, that we have been dealing with over this month is navigating the PhD terrain. And the topic that we are covering today is original contribution and conflict diagrams. Now, if you recall, in the last two workshops, that is workshop 14 and 15, and actually workshop 14, we did discuss issues of arguments and how you can actually advance arguments in academic research at the PhD level. And in workshop 15, we looked at originality, or what we call original contribution in academic research at the PhD. And if you recall the number of diagrams that I showed you in our previous workshop, especially what we refer to as conflict diagrams, and today I want to continue with the conflict diagrams. In other words, that's why the topic is original contribution and conflict diagrams, ladies and gentlemen. And what we'll be dealing in this workshop that will be relatively short, we'll be dealing with the constructing a conflict diagram from actions and probably decisions. And you need to develop this skill if you are going to provide originality or original contribution. The second aspect, ladies and gentlemen, will be for us to learn how to construct conflict diagrams or a conflict diagram from an undesirable state or what we call undesirable actions. And then, of course, later on, this will take us to workshop 17, which I'll be dealing with the aspect of using the diagrams to identify original contributions. And this is not a very simple thing, as you can see, but we'll be looking at the various perspectives, ladies and gentlemen. Again, in terms of the books that you're going to use, don't forget to get that book by Wenzel, Arnold Wenzel in 2018, Arnold Wenzel 2017, and then of course Alverson and Sandberg 2011, plus a number of other books that I've already given you, ladies and gentlemen. Right, now since we are dealing with the issues of constructing a conflict diagram from actions or decisions, I want to say right from the onset that to find original contributions, you should know how to construct a conflict diagram for your chosen problems, right? I know you may observe reality out there and you know what exists in literature, but unless you know how to construct conflict diagrams, it will be quite hard for you to really come up with a contribution. So constructing a conflict diagram from actions or decisions will help you to find original contribution, ladies and gentlemen, and that is the kind of role and the purpose of this workshop. And there are several ways, ladies and gentlemen, to do this, several ways to construct conflict diagrams, and this workshop will demonstrate two possible methods as explained in Wenzel 2017 from page 50 to page 55. And of course, one major limitation to be aware of is that conflict diagrams are best suited to real-world problems. So if you want to really construct conflict diagrams, you must have real-life situations. You must go out and extract reality, identify a problem, identify an issue, and then construct your conflict diagram from reality out there, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, as you can see, for purely theoretical problems, it is better to use the technique for questions, which will be explained later. I will demonstrate to you this technique of using questions, and that is for theoretical questions or theoretical issues, but for practical problems, we draw conflict diagrams, and of course, this is very important. And sometimes, as we can see, these are problems that exist in policy areas or policy arenas, and especially where stakeholders are caught between actions. And I'll also give you a typical example in the discipline of sustainability, right? What we call sustainable development goals. Of course, where you try to meet the needs and the wants of the current generation without disadvantaging the needs and the wants of the future generations. And of course, this can be very troubling and problematic because it's not quite easy for you to stand in this time at the moment and predict what the needs, especially the ethical and environmental and ecological and what you may call economic issues that are likely, and psychological issues that are likely to pertain 50 years or 100 years from today, ladies and gentlemen, especially when you are dealing with issues of sustainability, ladies and gentlemen, because you talk about economic sustainability, and then you can talk about social sustainability, and then you can talk about environmental sustainability, ladies and gentlemen. But I'll use that example so that we try to deliberate around those issues and try to understand what happened. So we are going to attempt to draw conflict diagrams, ladies and gentlemen. So, as you can see, in such a case, we start from the action boxes, right? If you want to develop conflict diagrams, then we start from the action boxes. I hope you still remember the diagram that I showed you here. Let me just again project this diagram so that you understand exactly what you're talking about. This is our figure 5, right? You can see figure 5 here. And you can see here you have got the common goals, yes, and then you have the need, and of course the resources there. But anyway, still it will be quite important for us to return to this diagram and have a thorough discussion and a thorough treat of this diagram. And do not forget that this is a diagram that we had earlier on in our workshop 15, ladies and gentlemen. So again, as you can see, these are usually issues that you will find in the communities where you have various stakeholders who are caught in between two actions or two decisions, right? And they do not know exactly what to do, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, one group has to encounter some bit of trade-offs, or what we call dilemmas or even problems. And of course, when you find statements, individuals saying that on the one hand, we should do this, on the other hand, we should be doing this other kind of thing. The moment you start listening to such statements, then of course we see these deliberations resulting into conflicting actions or decisions, ladies and gentlemen. And in such a case, we start from the action boxes and work our way backwards. So if you look at the boxes you have here in this diagram here, you have, of course, if you look at that kinked line called V, then up there you have use resources, right? And then down you have what we call control the use of resources. If you're dealing with sustainability issues, right, economic sustainability, social sustainability, those are the issues that we'll be talking about. You want to develop a certain community, you want to develop a certain society so that they get out of poverty, for instance. But then, of course, there are arguments and counter-arguments. So some people will tell you, use the available resources in the communities to develop that community. Others will say, use those resources wisely and sparingly, of course, knowing that at the end of the day, you may end up destroying the environment, ladies and gentlemen. As you can see, in such a case, we start from the action boxes and work our way backwards. So let's take a simple real-world problem from disciplines dealing with sustainability development, as I've already indicated. Now, often when opportunities arise for communities to lift themselves out of poverty, and of course using things like maybe oil extraction, for instance, mining or tourism, right? There is a conflict between those who want to allow people to use the available resources of the community as they see fit. And of course, there are also those individuals who believe and they argue that certain regulations must be put in place on how resources are utilized. So I think you can see now, right, the argument and the counter-argument, what you can call A, the actions called A, and delta A, and that is the counter-action, or what we call the counter-argument, ladies and gentlemen. So let's work together this afternoon or this evening, ladies and gentlemen, to construct a diagram step by step. So follow me as we move through these steps so that we are able to construct a conflict diagram that will certainly help us to provide a contribution. And of course, later on we have to develop what we call a theorized storyline. And that was our workshop 7, I think. Yeah, workshop 7, because workshop 8 was on literature review, or maybe vice versa. So developing a theorized storyline is very important, and you may have to go back and review that. So let's move systematically step by step, right? The diagram is still here on board, and if it were possible, even the steps can be put alongside the diagram, probably one by one, right, so that we understand. Now, step number 1, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to say, since we have identified conflicting actions or decisions, we start by inserting them into the appropriate boxes as shown in figure 5, right? Figure 5 here, where you have the kinked line, right? Action A is inserted in that last box where you have use resources freely. So you leave the communities to use the resources freely, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, later on, I will demonstrate to you and I will show you another diagram, which will be our figure 6, which will give us the outcome or the revised version of what we are talking about. But anyway, we place those things there, and I'm sure you can see that in box where you have A, right? And of course, here it doesn't matter which one goes in which box, as long as they are perceived as being in conflict, ladies and gentlemen. Now, step number 2, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, we derive, in step number 2, we derive the needs of the system. In this case, the communities struggling with this issue, right? So the communities are struggling. First of all, they want to improve, right? They want to be well off, right? But they want to use the resources in the community. And that is A, right? So, of course, the other aspect is to derive the needs of the system, and that's very important. And, of course, these should not be expressed as actions, right? Don't express the needs of the community in the form of actions, right? And, of course, for us to find these needs, we ask the question, what needs of the system will be satisfied by this action, right, of exploiting resources, right? You can also just ask, what does the system need this action or decision? So in this case, we ask, why do some people believe, right, will be achieved if the community or farms outside the community are allowed to use the resources freely? So of course, there are many arguments here and counter arguments, but this information is placed in this box here. The next one to A, which is actually R. That is what we call the R. And now you'll see an arrow connecting A to R, and that is R leads to A, and that is presented by Roman numeral 2, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen. That is in our figure 5, and that's very important. And then you can ask a number of questions, which I will not really go into at this material time, but one may argue that this will ensure that the community resources are used sustainably and not depleted, ladies and gentlemen. So of course, that is now for the other R dash, right? The other one, exploit the resources the way you want them to be exploited, or whatever the citizens see fit, that's what they will do. And then of course, if you are also arguing for the policy instruments to be put in place for these fellows to exploit these resources rightly, then you have R dash, and that will be in the lower box that we call need to, right? Then we go to section, step number 3, ladies and gentlemen. Then here you need to ask yourself, what do both sides hope to achieve by meeting their respective needs? So the one that advocates for policies and the other one that doesn't advocate for policies, what do they want to achieve at the end of the day? So if you have R and R dash, then what they're advocating for is the G, and that is the goal. So, and of course, at the end of the day, as you can see, if you analyze in step 3, right, if you analyze the upper bit where you have arrow that's represented by Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, and you compare it with 3 and 4, you'll find conflicts, ladies and gentlemen, and therefore you will be having a conflict gap there. So, but anyway, insert the G in the G box, as you can see, because that's the common goal. At the end of the day, these two aim at achieving that. And of course, finally, ladies and gentlemen, we test the logical flow. So we start now testing this, and this is an important step, so we should spend a significant amount of time on this, because we must really test and understand this. Now, it is extremely rare that you will get the logical flow right the first round. Now, if the logical flow, ladies and gentlemen, does not feel right, continue revising it, continue revising and revising and revising until it does make sense. Now, when reading from left, now, of course, the other time when we're in our workshop 15, we're reading from the left, I think. We read from left, if I'm not mistaken. Now, even now we can read from left, right? So when reading from left to right, read as follows. If we want G, we want to achieve G, right? And that is really a common goal in the community. We want people to be well off. We want to really drive away poverty, right? Then we must R, right? So that means the needs of these fellows, so the needs of the system must be addressed. And these are R, right? And if we want R, we have to A. So those are the things that you need to do, and those are the actions. So this uses the logic obligation, which I prefer because it recognizes that the problem arises from the human actions, right? Of course, using the resources freely, and of course, also limiting the use of these resources. So you can actually start from there. Now, to double check, I also recommend that you read Goldratt that actually starts from right to left. So there we started from left, right, but you can also start from right to left. But we can also attempt to read right, the information presented at the table from right to left. So now when reading from right to left, how do we do it? Still, as you can see this on the diagram, we say if we do A, of course action A, and that is now use resources freely or control the use of resources. If we do that, it will lead to R, right? And R here will be in terms of the needs of the system, right? So it will lead to R, and if R, therefore, we achieve A, it will lead to A, right? And that's the way we really define, the way we read it, right? That's when, if we decide to read from left to right, right? If we do M, right, it will lead to R, right? And of course, R again, once you do it very well, you address the needs, it will lead to G, as you can see. Now here we use the classical logic of causality. And in both cases, ladies and gentlemen, the reading is grammatical and reasonable according to some view in the discipline, right? In other words, you must check your diagram against the established knowledge in the discipline, even if you don't agree with it. And the actions conflict in some way, and if it conflicts, then you have room for making a contribution, ladies and gentlemen. So what I'm going to do, ladies and gentlemen, now is to demonstrate to you a second figure, figure 6, because if you do that very well, then you'll be able to move from that figure to go to figure 6. And that's how we really construct the logical diagram as you can see it, right? So of course you can see here we have now introduced other notations, whereas there we had the R dash, right? Use of policy and so forth. In this case, we are using delta A, right? A delta A, we have R delta R, and then we have that kind of thing. So in other words, we are trying to aim at coming up with a conflict diagram, and that's why we go to step number 2. And of course, this leads us to figure number 6, as you can see. Now again, see figure number 6, reading it from left to right makes sense, right? So you start from left to right, makes sense. If we want development of the community, as you can see here, then we must create as many jobs as possible. And if we want to create as many jobs as possible, we must use resources freely. Right, that's what we have there. Right, development of the community, create jobs, give people jobs, right? Their standard of living will improve, right? Their incomes will go up, and therefore, these benefits certainly are as a result of exploiting resources, using resources freely. So if we want development of the community, we must sustainably. Of course, the first aspect that let them use the resources freely. Now, if you look at the lower bit, where you have delta A, delta R, again leading to G, it actually means that if you want development of the community, we must sustainably use the community's resources. So sustainable use of resources is very important, and to sustainably use its resources, we must control the use of resources. And that's what you have there. Development of the community, sustainable use of the community resources, and then you achieve that by controlling the resources. Now, using resources freely is in a conflict with controlling their usage, ladies and gentlemen. Now, similarly, reading from right to left, we can actually read now from right to left, also makes sense, right? So let's read from right to left and see what that gives us. Now, from right, you can see where you have A, right? If we use resources freely, right, then we will create as many jobs as possible. And if we create as many jobs as possible, then we will have development of the community. So I think you can see the kind of perspective and interpretation you attach to this diagram when you are actually reading it from various perspectives. And that's how you should always read your charts, right? And even conceptual models, incidentally, right? So if we control the use of resources, then we use the community's resources sustainably if you are looking at the delta A and delta R, right? And if we sustainably use the resources, then we'll have the development of the community. Now, as a side note, ladies and gentlemen, there is another approach on which I won't expound here, but which we shall be discussing later on, which is found in Wenzel 2017. And this method involves starting the construction process from either a common goal or the requirements, but is more challenging, as we shall see later on. So let's now move to constructing a conflict diagram from an undesirable state, right? So the one we've seen here, right, is really looking at what the community wants to achieve, coming from actions or decisions, ladies and gentlemen, either to use resources freely or to have constrained use of resources, ladies and gentlemen. Now, of course, we can have another diagram now that involves what we call undesirable states. So we can construct a conflict diagram from undesirable state. As you can see, sometimes the actions are not so clear, ladies and gentlemen, but you have the sense that there is a situation in which the current state of some system is not ideal, right? And therefore, we can actually have an example here to try and explain what we are talking about. Again, I'll show you this diagram on the board here. We've seen diagram 5, 6. Now we go to diagram 7, and we shall be seeing diagram 8 as well. And of course here, diagram 7 and diagram 8, we actually look at a conflict diagram, but coming from undesirable state. So sometimes actions are not so clear. You have the sense that there is a situation in which the current state of affairs or some system is not really ideal, right? Calling to what we call undesirable state. The company, for instance, is not making profits. In other words, you have a deficit, you have a gap from reality out there. Or probably the community is suffering, right? The welfare of the community is not really improving, right? Having adopted a number of policies. Inflation is persistently going up, despite the fact that you have come up with a number of policies to try and control inflation. But the inflation is getting out of hand. Right, in such a situation, then you can use what we call undesirable state to come up with a conflict diagram that you can use actually to demonstrate the need for further investigation by coming up with something that is entirely new. So this undesirable state, as you can see, can be derived, ladies and gentlemen, from a question or narrative of the problem, which suggests that what is actually happening in the system is different from what should be happening at that material time. Now, in this workshop, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to demonstrate, right, how to derive a conflict diagram, as I said earlier on, from such undesirable state, right? How do we then construct this conflict diagram that will demonstrate originality? So let's take an issue, ladies and gentlemen, that most people are familiar with, namely migration. We want to use migration. Europe has just experienced this migration. USA has had a problem when certainly Trump ascended on the presidential chair. Of course, he came up with a number of policies, and one of the policies that he came up with was to control migration and also to cross the people entering the country outside. And of course, Uganda, on the other hand, received the praises from the international community for having a liberal policy of allowing anybody who was to come into the country here, ladies and gentlemen. But anyhow, let's take an example of migration, because it brings out this point very well, because it can be seen as undesirable state, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why now I want us to construct a conflict diagram using the steps in figure 7, right? So, and of course the final product will appear in figure 8, right? Now if you look at the board here, you will be able to see figure 7, right? And we are going to, I'll take you through the steps, ladies and gentlemen, which again will lead us to figure 8, right? Now, of course, let me give you the steps here. And the first step is we need to answer the question, right? And this basic question we are going to answer, as you can see on the diagram here, where you have A, right? That's our first point. What main need of the system is being jeopardized by the way countries are handling migration flows? So is there a system that is being jeopardized by the way various countries of the world are handling this issue of migration? Now, in order to do this, we first need to know what we mean by system, right? If you don't understand the system of handling migration, then it will be very hard for you to articulate the issues properly and nicely, and therefore you will not be able to come up with a conflict diagram that will demonstrate originality in the kind of research that you are doing. So again, in this case, it would be governments or countries. So when we talk about systems, we are talking about governments, especially the developed world that closed out the migrants who are going that side. And of course, Italy suffered at the end of the day, right? But of course, these are the economies that receive migrants from less developed countries, and of course, try to limit the rights or inflows of migrants, ladies and gentlemen. So that was step number 1. Step number 1 requires us to identify, right, and even question a number of issues relating to the system, right, but we raise questions like, what main need of the system that has been developed by those countries, right, is being jeopardized by the way countries are handling migration flows? Right, then from there you move to the second point, or step number 2, right, and step number 2, you will now refer to the problem. Referring to the problem, the way they manage the inflows, for example, of migrants, we now try to find R, right? And I think you can see on the diagram here, A, you have A, the diagram there, those are actions, and then R, what needs of the system are being jeopardized. And then, of course, G is the common goal that these developed countries are attempting to achieve. Right, of course, A are the actions. What actions or decisions must be taken to ensure that this problem of migration is handled properly? So, of course, for step number 2, referring to the problem, then, of course, the problem relates to the management of the inflows. So what is the need in the system, right? It has to be expressed as a need. So consider why it is important to solve the need, and what need is not being satisfied in as far as the problem is concerned. Maybe it is that the way they manage the influx is not proper and it prevents them from obtaining the benefits from migration, etc., etc. Interrogate the system really so that you actually get this step number 2 solved. From there, we move to step number 3. That's the next question, goes to the opposing side of the conflict. What action or decision is blocking us from getting rid of this problem? And that's why you have R, and then you have delta R. You have A and delta A. Remember, when you are constructing conflict diagrams, you always look at the actions, and then you look at the counter arguments, right? Or delta A, not A. Those are the things that create conflict. Then, of course, are the needs of the system, and then you have the counter needs there, right? And of course, what we intend to achieve at the end of the day. So step number 4 is to find the opposing action, and that is really the next question that must be posed, right? Must take you to that aspect of the opposing action, right? What action or decision must you take to get rid of the problem, right? And of course, as you can see from the diagram here, right, you will be able to come up with G, right? What are we trying to achieve at the end of the day? To find the opposing question, the opposing action, ladies and gentlemen, you ask yourself that question. Step number 4 is to find the opposing action. The next question is, what action or decision must you take to get rid of the problem? And once again, you need to note that it has to be an action or a decision. In this case, it is simply the opposite approach. That is to remove national barriers to migration, and these should be filled inside the A box, ladies and gentlemen. And step number 5, the next question tries to find the reason for the opposing action or decision by asking what need or the system is being satisfied by this action. And this has to be a need again. So you ask yourself, why do countries maintain barriers to migration? What need did this satisfy? This is usually to prevent the perceived harmful effects of migration into a country. And so inside the R dash, right, we present this information, prevent harmful effects of migration. And then we go to step number 6. As you can see, the last question acknowledges that both sides try to achieve the same thing, right? If you have R and R dash, you have A and A dash, at the end of the day you want to achieve the same thing, right? And what, you ask yourself a question, what are we trying to achieve at the end of the day? And this has to be expressed as a goal. So what is the common goal between the two needs, ladies and gentlemen? And what do both of them want to achieve? Now both, box G, right, which is the extreme box here, is filled in with very broad common goal, such as a labor force that contributes to economic growth or economic development or increase the country's welfare. We then move to step number 7, and step number 7 is where we test the logical flow by reading the boxes from left to right and from right to left, as explained earlier, right? And when we do that, we check that the actions or decisions are in conflict, ladies and gentlemen. And here, irrespective of whether you agree with the view or not, in either case, the reading should be both grammatically sound and reasonable. And what we mean here is that it must be accepted by the disciplinary audience, where you are contributing knowledge. And of course, this is usually in accordance with some theoretical or empirical view of the discipline. Now, if the actions also conflict in some way, then the logical flow ladies and gentlemen, is acceptable. Now, there are other ways to approach the construction of a logical flow, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, what I'm going to do now is to take you to the other, to show you the two diagrams there. And those two diagrams, diagram 7 and diagram 8, presented at the same time, will be able to show us exactly what we want to achieve, right? Again, I've already articulated the issues in diagram 7. Now let me read for you the issues in diagram 8, and then thereafter we shall try to close. So again, with figure 7, that was the stepwise method of finding a conflict from undesirable effect source, right? And you have already seen that. And figure 8 is a conflict diagram for the problem of migration source from Wenzel, right? And I've taken you through those steps: step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, step 6, right? And step 7. So let me now do this. Since we have these diagrams, especially down in figure 8, you've got A, right, and delta A, you've got R and delta R. Let's try to read what is there, right? So let's begin by asking ourselves, right, this question: what action would you prefer? And that will become now delta A, right? Remember, for A, the question we asked was, what action or decision do you complain about? So which becomes box A. So what are you complaining about? Is it a problem of migration? Is it a problem of employment? Is it a problem of, yes, but what action would you prefer? That will now become delta A. Now from the action, the requirements can be obtained by asking, what needs are you trying to satisfy with A, which becomes R, and what need are you trying to satisfy with delta A, which becomes R dash. Then finally we can ask, what is the common objective achieved by R, as you can see on the diagram here, and R dash, which becomes G. Now once the conflict is constructed, as you can see represented by that kinked line V5, when the conflict is constructed, it can be used to elicit the assumption as explained earlier, as discussed earlier, ladies and gentlemen. Now, in doing so, we identify the significant assumptions, and these will become the raw material that goes into the process of generating original contributions, ladies and gentlemen. And it's very important that we always try to look at what we consider to be original contribution. So, ladies and gentlemen, I really want to stop here and close in this workshop, and then we shall follow that this up in our workshop 17, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, to close, I want to thank you very much for having attended this workshop. Just remind you a few things. This was workshop 16 under the series, PhD seminar series in business management, and under the theme of navigating the PhD terrain. In this particular workshop, we have been discussing issues that relate to original contribution and conflict diagrams, ladies and gentlemen. How you can use conflict diagrams to come up with originality or original contribution to knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. And in this workshop, we have discussed issues of constructing a conflict diagram from actions or decisions. We have also looked at constructing a conflict diagram from an undesirable state like that of migration. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been unable in this workshop to move to the next level of using the diagram to identify original contribution, and that will be the subject of our next workshop. I can always say, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming, and stay well, stay safe. I wish you a nice time. Bye.